And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. On this podcast, we're going to continue talking about market failures. I've talked on this playlist about public goods as a market failure. And now on this video, we're going to talk about another market failure, and that is common resources. Common resources are another market failure. And so, common resources, when we think about common resources, we think about what economists call the tragedy of the commons, the tragedy of the commons. And if we're going to think about the tragedy of commons, then we want to think about what it means for something to be common. What does it mean for something to be common? And really what we're getting at here is, what does it mean to own something if something is held in common? So the way I want to think about this is, if we call something common, if we say something's common, that means that it's kind of owned by everybody. It's owned by everybody. That means everybody owns it and kind of shares it together. But when we say it's owned by everybody, that's almost kind of another way of saying that it's owned by nobody. That means that nobody really has full ownership of this, and therefore nobody really has an incentive maybe to take care of it. So tragedy of the commons, this explains why resources get overused, and I'm going to connect it back to this here in a minute. So what happens when you have tragedy of the commons, when you have a common resource, is that resources are going to get overused relative to the social optimum, and that's going to be our problem, is going to be the costs outweigh the benefits, but it's still going to happen. There's going to be behavior that's going to happen when the costs outweigh the benefits. We're going to overuse whatever that common resource is, and we'll look at the example here in a second. So this is so common resources are goods that are non-excludable but rivalrous. They are non-excludable but rivalrous. So here's an example. Here's an example of this. So if we can imagine an area called the Commons, an area called the Commons in maybe, I forget, 1500, 1600, something like this in Europe. There was this area that was called the Commons, right? So people had their own little plots of land where they could grow crops and things like this, but then they had a common area where they could take their animals to graze. So I apologize, these are supposed to be little sheep here. And people could take their sheep out to graze on this big common area where there was grass, and these sheep could go eat their grass. And it wasn't a big problem because there were not very many sheep, and so there was plenty of grass for everybody. But as populations grow, as we look over here over time, populations grow, and there's a larger, more people with more sheep, and now this common area that's not owned by anybody can take their sheep there anytime. This common area now is going to start to get awfully crowded, and so what's going to happen is these sheep, people are going to take their sheep out and they're going to eat a lot of the grass, and they're probably not going to replant the grass. Why are they going to not replant the grass? Well, because they don't really own it. Okay, they don't really own that grass. So if I plant grass and then someone else's sheep come and eat that new grass that I worked hard to get growing, I'm probably not going to do that. I'm not going to bother. And so when you have this common area, everybody has an incentive to take their sheep out and eat as much grass as they can before the next sheep come out and eat the grass. And they have no incentive to take care of the grass, grow more grass, stuff like that. And so that's what I mean when I say that it's going to be overused. It's going to be overused. They're going to consume the grass as a result of not owning it. And so the common resource, here's our problem, the common resource is going to be overconsumed relative to the social optimum. We're not going to be at the social optimum where we eat a little bit of grass, save some for the future so that we can graze again tomorrow. That's not going to happen. Everybody's going to have an incentive to go out and consume as much grass as quickly as possible. It's kind of similar. It's similar to the negative externality problem of overusing a resource and diminishing the amount that is available to others when you do so. Okay, so we go out and we eat all this grass as fast as we can, and that leaves less available for other people. So what do we do to solve this problem? Well, I don't like the way that I wrote this one here. So I'm just going to rewrite it over on the side. I mean, it's correct, but the first solution is regulation, which is command. I talked about this on an earlier video. Command and control. Command and control. So command and control regulation solution might be something like, we might say, everybody can only let their sheep graze for an hour a day. Done. Same for everybody. Command control. It's a rule, and everybody just has to follow it. That'd be one possibility. Another possibility is we could tax the use of the land. So you can use the land as much as you want, but you have to pay a $5 tax every time you take your sheep out to graze. That would be another possibility. And then the third possibility is an ownership possibility. That is to say, we could create private property rights. We could create private property rights. We create private property rights. And so what that looked like in the 1600s in England is what was called the enclosure movement, if I have this terminology correct. And essentially, at least from my mind as an economist, that just means we're going to build fences. So we build a fence, and now this is somebody's land, and only their sheep can graze there. And now, all of a sudden, they have an incentive to not eat all the grass. And they have an incentive to grow more grass and take care of it over time. And then we put another fence, maybe another fence is going to go right here, and then this person's going to own this section of land, and maybe another fence is going to go here, and this person owns land, and this person owns land. And as soon as people get ownership, now they no longer have an incentive to overuse. They actually have an incentive to take care of it and preserve it for the future. So Aristotle, he recognized this idea a long time ago. He said, what is common to many is least cared for. Okay? What is common to many is taken least care of. When we all own something together, we don't really have an incentive to take care of it. Okay? For all men have a greater regard for what is their own. That's why private property rights will solve this problem. They all have greater regard for what they own than what they possess in common, in common. And so this is a common resource problem. I just think about it with my house, with my household. We have a common resource problem, and that is that. So I have 3 children, and so what would happen is my wife would go buy a bag of cookies at the grocery store on a Friday night, and she'd put them in the cupboard, and by Sunday they're all gone because the cookies become a common resource. Nobody owns them, so all 3 children have an incentive to eat them as fast as they possibly can before another kid gets them. So you have an incentive to eat them as fast as you can, and next thing you know, they eat too many cookies, and by Sunday night the cookies are all gone. So what do? We did an enclosure movement in a way. We did an enclosure movement. And so what we did is each kid got a container with their name on it. We brought the cookies home, and each kid got a third of the cookies, and their cookies were put into their container, and we established private property rights over that group of cookies, and then that was it. You can only eat cookies out of your container, okay? And then what we found was that there were still cookies available later in the week. That is to say that they were saving them because they didn't want to eat them all just in one day and then not have any cookies the rest of the week. Actually, one of my children did just to eat them all, but then he had to live with not having them for the rest of the week, and another one would save them for the week. He'd spread them out and eat them slowly. So you could do whatever you wanted, but once it's your private property, you have a greater incentive to take care of it. That's a common resource. Now, let me just say very quickly a couple of other examples of common resources. Clean air and clean water tend to be common resources, and so people will pollute them, dump their trash into rivers or oceans, blow smoke, burn whatever for heat, and blow that waste up into the air. And they have an incentive to do a lot of it because they don't own the air. It's a common resource problem, so they over pollute it. Congested roads, since roads don't have prices, everybody has an incentive to just use the roads as much as possible. possible, and then we have a lot of traffic. All kinds of wildlife, fish, whales was a big one. Nobody owned all the whales, and so in the ocean, and so as a result of that, the whale population was dropping rapidly because everybody was just killing whales as quickly as possible because there was no private property rights over them. That was a common resource problem. Buffaloes suffered from a common resource problem, and we saw the population of buffaloes drop at one point from 60 million to 400. That's an incredible decline, and same. We can think about other animals like this. Like a cow, we treat as a private good, and so we have a lot of them. But elephants, we treat as common resources. Many places you're not allowed to own them, or things like this, and so people don't have an incentive to take care of them. They just kill them and sell the tusks and so on. And so the elephant population declines while the cow population grows. So the common resource problems are all around us. So here's the thing. The ultimate cause of externality problems, of common resource problems, of the inefficiencies that exist are an absence of clearly defined private property rights. That's ultimately what the problem is. And the market will always is a strong word, but I want to say we're at least close to always. The market will at least almost always result in efficient outcomes. That means producing at the social optimum if you have clearly defined private property rights. Okay? But private property rights are sometimes very difficult to define. Right? Defining private property rights over whales. How would we do that? How would we possibly do that? Or fish in the ocean, how would we do that? Or defining private property rights over air, how would we do that? So it can be very difficult. Improvements in technology may help. Maybe someday we are going to have ownership over fish in the ocean, and every fish will be tagged by satellite or something like this. But I don't think that's not practical right now. So, okay, common resources. Let me just say this one more time. We prefer, I don't want to speak for all economists, so I'm thinking myself, I prefer a private property rights solution to common resources if it's possible. If it's not possible, then we could use a tax to reduce the overuse of a good, and if we can't do that for some reason, then we would go to the command and control. Then we would go to the command and control. Okay, so that's a common resource and some of the solutions. All right, this has been Mr. Hagan on another podcast. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next Econ podcast.